Before anyone ever wore a house scarf or sat beneath the sorting hat, there was a much simpler question. What kind of witch or wizard would you become? Long before rivalries formed and legacies took shape, 4 founders imagined a school that could shape magical talent in very different ways. But what they created was not just a place of learning. It was a system that would quietly define generations. Each house carried its own values, its own expectations, and its own path. And over time, those paths began to shape the entire wizarding world in ways most never stopped to think about. Long before Hogwarts existed, magic was something far less structured and far more uncertain. It was not something that could be learned in a classroom or refined through a carefully designed curriculum. Instead, it was scattered, passed quietly between individuals, often within families, and sometimes discovered by accident. A young witch or wizard might begin to notice strange things happening around them, objects moving without touch, emotions affecting the world in subtle ways. But there was rarely anyone there to explain it clearly. For many, magic began as confusion before it ever became understanding. In those early centuries, magical knowledge was fragmented. Some witches and wizards lived in small communities, sharing what they knew with one another, while others remained isolated, guarding their abilities in secret. There were no standardized spells, no shared rules, and certainly no agreement on what magic should be used for. One person might dedicate their life to healing and protection, while another might pursue darker, more dangerous forms of magic without restriction. There was no system to guide them, and no authority to correct them when things went wrong. This lack of structure created a world where magic was unpredictable and often dangerous. Without proper guidance, spells could backfire, potions could fail, and magical creatures could be mishandled with serious consequences. Knowledge was often incomplete, passed down through memory rather than written record, which meant that important details could be lost or misunderstood over time. A spell taught one way in one region might be performed entirely differently in another, leading to inconsistent results and sometimes catastrophic mistakes. At the same time, there was another problem that shaped the lives of magical people just as much as their lack of education: fear. To those without magic, the abilities of witches and wizards were deeply unsettling. Muggles, unable to understand what they were witnessing, often responded with suspicion, hostility, and at times, outright violence. Stories of magic spread quickly, but rarely in a positive way. Instead, they became warnings, tales of danger, and reasons to act against those who were different. Because of this, many witches and wizards chose to hide. They concealed their abilities, avoided drawing attention, and lived carefully among non-magical communities. Magic was practiced quietly, often at night or in isolation, and always with the awareness that discovery could lead to serious consequences. This secrecy limited the ability of magical people to learn from one another. It prevented collaboration, discouraged experimentation, and kept knowledge divided into small, disconnected pockets. But even within this hidden world, patterns began to emerge. Certain individuals became known for their skill, their wisdom, or their power. Others sought them out, hoping to learn. Informal mentorships began to form, with experienced witches and wizards passing their knowledge to a select few. These relationships were often the closest thing to education that existed at the time, but they were inconsistent and depended entirely on chance. If you were fortunate enough to find a capable teacher, you might develop your abilities. If not, you were left to navigate magic on your own. Over time, it became increasingly clear that this approach was not sustainable. Magic was too complex, too powerful, and too unpredictable to be left without structure. Without a shared system of learning, each new generation was forced to start from an uneven foundation. Some advanced quickly, while others struggled or failed entirely. And more importantly, there was no way to ensure that magic was being used responsibly. This raised a deeper question, one that would eventually shape the future of the wizarding world. What should a witch or wizard actually be? Was magic simply a tool to be used however the individual saw fit? Or was there a responsibility that came with it, a need for guidance, discipline, and perhaps even values that should be taught alongside skill? Different witches and wizards began to form their own answers to that question. Some believed that magical ability alone was what mattered, that power and knowledge should be pursued without limitation. Others believed that magic should be guided by principles, that character was just as important as capability. There were those who valued intelligence above all else, and those who believed loyalty and fairness were the true foundations of strength. These ideas did not yet have names, and they were not yet organized into anything formal, but they existed, quietly shaping the way individuals approached magic. And as these beliefs developed, so too did the realization that they could not remain scattered forever. The wizarding world needed more than just isolated teachers and hidden communities. It needed a place where knowledge could be gathered, refined, and shared. A place where young witches and wizards could be guided from the very beginning, rather than left to figure things out on their own. And perhaps most importantly, it needed a system that could address not just how magic was used, but why. This was the world that existed before Hogwarts, a world of potential, but also of uncertainty. A world where magic was real, powerful, and ever-present, but lacked the structure needed to truly understand it. And it was from this uncertainty that a new idea would eventually emerge. Not just a school, but a foundation. One that would bring together different philosophies, different values, and different visions of what magic should become. At some point, separate ideas began to move in the same direction. Different witches and wizards, living in different places and shaped by different experiences, came to a similar conclusion. Magic could not remain scattered forever. It needed to be taught, refined, and understood in a way that would outlast any single lifetime. And from that shared realization, 4 individuals would eventually come together, each carrying their own vision of what that future should look like. Godric Gryffindor was known for his boldness. He believed that magic should be used with courage, and that bravery was not something reserved for a few, but something that could be cultivated in anyone willing to face what frightened them. He valued action over hesitation, and saw strength not just in power, but in the willingness to stand against it when necessary. To him, a great witch or wizard was defined by what they chose to do when it mattered most. Rowena Ravenclaw approached magic from a different angle. Where Gryffindor saw courage, she saw understanding. She believed that the true potential of magic could only be reached through knowledge, and that intelligence was the foundation upon which everything else was built. For her, curiosity was not just a trait, but a responsibility. The more one understood, the more capable they became of shaping the world around them. She valued precision, creativity, and the quiet pursuit of learning. Helga Hufflepuff brought something else entirely. While others focused on traits that set individuals apart, she focused on what connected them. She believed that magic should be accessible to all who were willing to learn, not just those who showed exceptional ability early on. Patience, loyalty, and hard work mattered just as much as talent. Where others might select only the most promising students, she believed in giving everyone a chance to grow, trusting that dedication would reveal strength over time. Salazar Slytherin, however, saw things through a much narrower lens. He valued ambition, resourcefulness, and the preservation of magical lineage. To him, power was something that needed to be protected and cultivated carefully. He believed that magic should be kept within those who understood it best, and that not everyone could be trusted with it. While the others saw potential in a wide range of individuals, Slytherin saw risk. His vision was not just about teaching magic, but about controlling who had access to it. Despite these differences, they were united by a single idea. The wizarding world needed a place of learning, a place where knowledge would not be lost, where young witches and wizards could be guided from the beginning, and where magic could be studied in a structured and meaningful way. And so, they worked together to bring that idea into existence. The early days of their collaboration were marked by cooperation. Each founder contributed something essential. Gryffindor brought strength and leadership, Ravenclaw brought knowledge and structure, Hufflepuff brought inclusivity and balance, and Slytherin brought ambition and a focus on long-term legacy. Together, they created something far greater than any one of them could have built alone. But even as they worked toward the same goal, their differences did not disappear. They simply remained beneath the surface, shaping the way each founder imagined the future of the school. When it came time to decide how students would be taught, these differences began to take on greater importance. It was no longer just about creating a place of learning. It was about deciding what kind of witches and wizards that place would produce. Each founder began to favor students who reflected their own values. Gryffindor admired those who showed bravery, even in small ways. Ravenclaw sought out those with sharp minds and a hunger for knowledge. Hufflepuff welcomed those who were willing to work hard and remain loyal. Slytherin selected those who showed ambition and a desire to rise above others. At first, this division was natural, even helpful. It allowed each founder to focus on guiding students in a way that aligned with their strengths. Over time, however, these preferences began to solidify into something more permanent. The founders were not just teaching students, they were shaping them according to their own beliefs. And while this created a rich and varied environment, it also introduced a quiet tension. Each founder believed, in their own way, that their approach was the most effective. Still, for a time, the balance held. The school grew, students learned, and magic became something that could be understood rather than feared. Hogwarts began to establish itself as a cornerstone of the wizarding world, a place where knowledge was preserved and passed on, where young witches and wizards could develop their abilities in a controlled environment. But beneath that success, the original question remained unresolved. What truly defined a great witch or wizard? Was it courage, intelligence, loyalty, or ambition? Each founder had their answer, and as the school continued to grow, those answers would begin to shape its future in ways none of them could fully predict. What they had created was more than a school. It was a reflection of 4 very different philosophies brought together under one roof. And while that unity allowed Hogwarts to exist, it also ensured that those differences would never fully disappear. As the school continued to grow, a quieter concern began to take shape among the founders. It was not about buildings or spells or even the safety of the students. It was about time. Each of them understood that they would not always be there to guide the next generation. And while they had managed to work together, despite their differences, there was no guarantee that those differences would remain balanced once they were gone. The question was simple, but difficult to answer. Who would decide where each student belonged when the founders were no longer there to choose? Up until that point, the process had been personal. Each founder would observe the students, speak with them, and decide for themselves who best fit their values. It was a system built on judgment, intuition, and direct involvement. But it was also a system that could not last. They needed something that could continue without them. Something that could preserve not just the structure of the school, but the philosophies that defined it. The solution they arrived at was both practical and unusual. Instead of appointing successors to carry on their work, they chose to embed their own decision-making into an object that could endure beyond their lifetimes. That object became the sorting hat. It was not simply a tool, but a continuation of the founders themselves. Each one contributed a part of their own thinking, their own priorities, and their own understanding of what made a student suitable for their house. The hat was enchanted to consider the qualities that each founder valued and to weigh them carefully before making its decision. In this way, the founders ensured that their influence would remain long after they were gone. But even from the beginning, the system was more complex than it appeared. The hat did not simply assign students based on what they were. It also considered what they might become. It listened, observed, and in some cases, responded to the thoughts of the student themselves. This introduced something that had not existed before in the process of sorting: choice. A student could express a preference, and the hat might take that into account. This meant that the system was not entirely rigid. It allowed for interpretation, for flexibility, and for the possibility that a person was not defined solely by their current traits. At the same time, the hat still carried the weight of the founder's original beliefs, which meant that its decisions were always guided by those underlying philosophies. This balance between judgment and choice became one of the defining aspects of the sorting system. It was not entirely predictable, but it was not random either. It reflected both the nature of the student and the intentions of the founders, creating a result that felt personal, even if it followed a consistent pattern over time. In the early years, the introduction of the sorting hat brought a sense of continuity to Hogwarts. Students were still divided according to the values of the founders, but now the process could continue without direct involvement. The school no longer depended on the presence of those who created it. Instead, it operated on a system that carried their voices forward. However, this also meant that the divisions between students became more defined. What had once been a natural preference among the founders began to take on a more permanent form. Students were no longer simply guided by a particular founder. They were placed into houses that represented those founders, and over time, those houses developed their own identities. These identities were shaped not just by the founders, but by the students themselves. As each generation passed through Hogwarts, they added to the culture of their house. Traditions formed, expectations grew, and reputations began to take hold. Gryffindor became associated with bravery, Slytherin with ambition, Ravenclaw with intelligence, and Hufflepuff with loyalty. While these traits had always been present, the sorting system made them more visible, more defined, and more lasting. At the same time, the system also introduced limitations. Once a student was sorted, they were expected to align with the values of their house. This created a sense of belonging, but it also created assumptions. A student placed in one house might be seen in a certain way, regardless of the full range of their abilities or personality. Over time, these perceptions could become stronger than the individuals themselves. And yet, the sorting hat continued to operate with the same purpose it had been given from the beginning. It did not exist to confine students, but to guide them. It reflected the belief that understanding a person's strengths could help shape their future, but it also left room for something more subtle. The idea that a person was not fixed, that they could grow beyond the expectations placed upon them. This is what made the sorting system endure. It was not perfect, and it was not without its consequences, but it provided a foundation that allowed Hogwarts to function across centuries. It preserved the voices of the founders, maintained the structure of the school, and gave each new student a place to begin. What started as a solution to a practical problem became one of the most defining features of the wizarding world. The sorting hat was not just a method of organization. It was a reflection of the very question that led to the creation of Hogwarts in the first place. Not just how magic should be taught, but how people should be understood. Once the system was in place, the four houses began to take on a life of their own. What had started as a practical way to organize students slowly became something deeper. Each house was no longer just a reflection of its founders' preferences. It became a community, shaped by shared experience, daily routines, and the quiet influence of those who came before. Students did not simply attend lessons together. They lived alongside one another, studied late into the night in the same common rooms, and built relationships that often lasted long after they left the school. Over time, these shared experiences began to reinforce the identities of the houses. It was not just about being sorted once at the beginning. It was about growing within that environment, surrounded by others who had been placed there for similar reasons. Gryffindor House, for example, became known for its willingness to act. Students encouraged one another to take risks, to step forward rather than hesitate, and to value bravery even when the outcome was uncertain. This did not mean that every student was fearless, but it did create an atmosphere where courage was recognized and rewarded. Small acts of bravery, repeated over time, began to shape the expectations of the house. Ravenclaw developed in a different direction. Its students were drawn toward understanding, not just of magic, but of the world itself. Questions were valued, curiosity was encouraged, and knowledge was seen as something to pursue for its own sake. The environment within the house supported independent thinking, allowing students to explore ideas in their own way. Over time, this created a culture where intelligence was not just a trait, but a shared priority. Hufflepuff, often underestimated by others, built its identity around consistency and fairness. Its students were not defined by a single moment of brilliance or boldness, but by their willingness to put in effort over time. Loyalty to one another became a defining feature, creating a strong sense of trust within the house. This made Hufflepuff a place where students could rely on one another, not just in moments of success, but also in moments of difficulty. Slytherin, shaped by ambition, took a more focused approach. Its students were encouraged to think ahead, to consider their goals, and to find ways to achieve them. Resourcefulness became an important trait, as students learned to navigate challenges with careful planning rather than impulsive action. Over time, this created a reputation for determination, but also for a certain level of exclusivity, as the house placed importance on legacy and self-advancement. As these identities strengthened, the differences between the houses became more noticeable. Students began to see themselves not just as individuals, but as members of a group with a distinct character. This created a sense of belonging, but it also introduced competition. House points, inter-house events, and shared rivalries became part of everyday life, reinforcing the boundaries between each group. This competition was not always negative. It often motivated students to perform better, to contribute to their house, and to take pride in their achievements. At the same time, it could also lead to misunderstandings. Students might form opinions about other houses based on reputation rather than experience, leading to divisions that went beyond simple rivalry. Even so, the structure held. Each house continued to serve its purpose, providing students with an environment that reflected certain values while still being part of a larger whole. The founders had created something that could adapt over time, shaped not just by their original vision, but by the generations that followed. What became clear was that the houses were not static. They evolved, influenced by the students within them, the events they experienced, and the changing world outside the school. While the core values remained, the way those values were expressed could shift, creating subtle changes in the identity of each house over time. In this way, Hogwarts became more than just a place of learning. It became a system of identity, one that began the moment a student was sorted and continued long after they left. The houses were not simply categories. They were environments that shaped behavior, expectations, and the way individuals understood themselves in relation to others. And while the founders had each imagined their own ideal version of what a witch or wizard should be, what emerged was something more complex. A school where multiple ideas existed at once, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension, but always connected by the same foundation. As the houses became more defined, so too did the way students understood themselves within them. Being sorted was not just a moment at the beginning of the school year. It became a reference point, something students returned to as they made decisions, formed friendships, and developed their sense of identity. Over time, the qualities associated with each house began to feel less like descriptions and more like expectations. For some, this created clarity. A student placed in Gryffindor might begin to see bravery as something they were meant to demonstrate, even in situations where they felt uncertain. A Ravenclaw student might push themselves to understand more, to question more, because that was what was valued around them. In Hufflepuff, consistency and loyalty became guiding principles, shaping how students approached both their work and their relationships. And in Slytherin, ambition often became a lens through which success was measured, influencing how students planned their future. This influence was not always immediate. Many students arrived at Hogwarts without a clear understanding of what defined them. The sorting process offered a starting point, but it was the environment that followed that gave it meaning. Living among others who shared similar traits reinforced certain behaviors, making them feel natural over time. What began as a potential often became a habit and eventually a part of how a student saw themselves. At the same time, there were always those who did not fit perfectly into the expectations of their house. A student in Gryffindor might prefer caution over risk. A Ravenclaw might struggle with traditional forms of learning. A Hufflepuff might question the idea of loyalty, and a Slytherin might resist the pressure to pursue ambition above all else. These differences did not disappear simply because of the sorting. Instead, they existed alongside it, creating a more complex reality than the system suggested. The sorting hat itself acknowledged this complexity. It did not claim that a student belonged entirely to one set of traits. Rather, it made a decision based on what it believed would shape that student most effectively. In some cases, it recognized potential that had not yet fully developed. In others, it responded to a student's own preferences, allowing choice to play a role in the outcome. This meant that being sorted was not always about who a student already was, but about who they might become. This idea introduced a quiet tension into the system. If a student could grow beyond their assigned traits, then the boundaries between the houses were not as fixed as they appeared. A Ravenclaw could demonstrate bravery, a Hufflepuff could show ambition, a Slytherin could act with loyalty, and a Gryffindor could value knowledge. These overlaps existed constantly, even if they were not always recognized. Despite this, the structure of the houses continued to influence perception. Students were often seen first as members of their house, and only second as individuals. This shaped how they were treated, how they were expected to behave, and even how they judged themselves. Over time, these perceptions could become deeply ingrained, making it difficult to separate personal identity from house identity. And yet, the system remained effective in one important way. It provided direction, even if it was not perfectly accurate. It gave students a framework within which to grow. It offered a sense of belonging, a group to be part of, and a set of values to consider. For many, this was enough to guide their development in meaningful ways. The longer Hogwarts existed, the more this balance between individuality and structure became part of its identity. The houses did not define every aspect of a student's life, but they influenced enough of it to matter. They shaped friendships, rivalries, and the way students approached challenges. They provided both support and limitation, depending on how they were understood. What became clear over time was that the sorting process was not an endpoint, it was a beginning. It marked the start of a journey in which students would either grow into the expectations placed upon them or gradually move beyond them. And in that process, the true purpose of the houses began to take shape, not as fixed categories, but as starting points for something more flexible and personal. In this way, the system, created by the founders, continued to evolve, shaped not just by their original vision, but by the countless individuals who passed through it. Each student added something new, reinforcing certain ideas while quietly challenging others. And through that constant interaction, the meaning of each house continued to develop, never entirely fixed, but never entirely undefined either. Over time, the differences between the houses did not remain limited to values or identity. They began to influence how students interacted with one another on a daily basis. What had once been a simple system of organization gradually shaped friendships, alliances, and, in some cases, divisions that extended beyond the classroom. Students often formed their closest bonds within their own house. This was not by design alone, but by proximity. They shared dormitories, common rooms, and routines that naturally brought them together. Late conversations, shared challenges, and collective experiences created a sense of familiarity that was difficult to replicate with those outside their house. Over time, this familiarity became loyalty, and that loyalty became one of the strongest forces within the school. At the same time, interactions between houses became more defined. Competition played a significant role in this. House points, awarded for achievement and deducted for mistakes, created a system where the actions of one student could affect the standing of an entire group. This encouraged a sense of responsibility, but it also heightened awareness of other houses. Success was often measured not just by personal progress, but by how one's house compared to the others. This competition extended into other areas as well. Quidditch matches, in particular, became a visible expression of house pride. Each team represented more than just individual skill. It represented the identity of the house itself. Victories were celebrated collectively, while losses were felt just as widely. These events strengthened internal unity, but they also reinforced the idea that the houses were in constant comparison with one another. Despite this, cooperation was never entirely absent. Students from different houses attended the same lessons, worked together on assignments, and, at times, formed friendships that crossed house boundaries. These interactions revealed something important. While the houses shaped behavior, they did not completely define it. Individuals could still connect based on shared interests, experiences, or perspectives that had little to do with their assigned house. However, perceptions often made these connections more difficult. Each house carried a reputation, and those reputations influenced expectations. Gryffindors were seen as bold, Ravenclaws as intelligent, Hufflepuffs as dependable, and Slytherins as ambitious. While these descriptions were not entirely inaccurate, they were incomplete. They simplified complex individuals into recognizable patterns, making it easier to categorize them, but harder to understand them fully. These perceptions could lead to assumptions. A student might be judged before they had the chance to demonstrate who they really were. This was particularly noticeable in the way certain houses were viewed by others. Slytherin, for example, often faced suspicion, its focus on ambition interpreted as a willingness to prioritize personal gain over collective good. Hufflepuff, on the other hand, was sometimes underestimated, its emphasis on hard work seen as less impressive than more visible forms of talent. And yet, within each house, the reality was more nuanced. Students understood one another in ways that outsiders did not. They saw the effort behind achievements, the hesitation behind bold actions, and the complexity behind decisions that might appear simple from a distance. This internal understanding strengthened the bonds within each house, even as it made the differences between houses feel more pronounced. The structure of Hogwarts allowed all of this to exist at once. Unity and division, cooperation and competition, individuality and identity. The houses created a framework that encouraged both connection and contrast, shaping the social dynamics of the school in subtle but lasting ways. What emerged was not a system of strict separation, but a balance. Students were part of their house, but they were also part of the larger school. They competed against one another, but they also learned alongside one another. This dual structure allowed Hogwarts to function as both a collection of distinct communities and a single, unified institution. Over time, this balance became one of the defining features of the school. The houses did not isolate students completely, but they did influence how those students understood their place within the larger environment. They provided a sense of belonging, while also creating a context in which differences could be observed, compared, and, at times, challenged. In this way, the social structure of Hogwarts became an extension of the ideas that shaped its creation. Different values, existing side by side, interacting in ways that were sometimes cooperative and sometimes competitive, but always part of the same system. And through these interactions, students learned not just about magic, but about how to exist within a world where differences were both unavoidable and essential. As years passed, the influence of the houses extended beyond the walls of Hogwarts. What began as a system within a school gradually shaped the wider wizarding world. Former students carried their house identities with them, not as a formal label, but as something quieter, something that influenced how they thought, how they made decisions, and how they understood others. This was not always obvious at first. After leaving Hogwarts, witches and wizards entered a world that did not formally separate people by house. There were no house points, no shared dormitories, and no common rooms, and yet, the habits formed during those early years remained. The values encouraged within each house continued to guide behavior, even when the structure itself was no longer present. A former Gryffindor might be more willing to take initiative, to step into uncertain situations without waiting for certainty. A Ravenclaw might continue to seek understanding, approaching problems with analysis rather than instinct. A Hufflepuff might prioritize fairness and reliability, building trust over time rather than seeking immediate recognition. And a Slytherin might approach the world with a clear sense of direction, considering long-term outcomes and opportunities before acting. These tendencies were not absolute, but they were noticeable. Over time, they began to influence how individuals interacted within the broader magical community. Certain professions, environments, and roles seemed to attract particular traits. This did not mean that houses determined a person's path, but they often shaped how that path was approached. In some cases, these patterns reinforced existing perceptions. People began to associate certain qualities with certain outcomes, linking house identity with particular strengths. This could be useful, providing a general understanding of how someone might think or act, but it could also lead to assumptions that overlooked the complexity of individuals. The wizarding world, much like Hogwarts, developed its own version of these perceptions. Conversations, decisions, and relationships were sometimes influenced by an awareness of house background, even if it was not openly acknowledged. A shared house experience could create an immediate sense of familiarity, while a perceived difference could introduce distance. Despite this, the system did not create rigid divisions outside the school. Without the formal structure of Hogwarts, individuals had more freedom to define themselves beyond their house. They could choose which values to carry forward and which to leave behind. Some embraced their house identity fully, while others allowed it to fade into something less defined. What remained consistent, however, was the idea that the houses represented different ways of approaching the same world. They were not opposites, but variations, different perspectives, shaped by different priorities, all interacting within the same space. This diversity of thought became one of the strengths of the wizarding community, even if it was not always recognized as such. At the same time, The legacy of the founders continued to influence this broader environment. Their original philosophies, preserved through the sorting system, had extended far beyond the school itself. They had become part of the way magical people understood one another, shaping expectations in subtle but lasting ways. There were moments when these differences became more visible, particularly during times of conflict or uncertainty. In such moments, the values associated with each house could guide decisions in distinct directions. Some would act quickly, others would analyze, some would remain steady, and others would adapt strategically. These responses were not limited to house identity, but they often reflected the patterns that had been reinforced during a person's time at Hogwarts. And yet, even in these moments, the limitations of the system were clear. No single house held all the answers. Courage without understanding could lead to mistakes. Intelligence without action could result in hesitation. Loyalty without questioning could overlook problems. Ambition without restraint could create imbalance. It was only through the combination of these perspectives that a more complete approach could emerge. This realization, though not always stated directly, became part of the deeper meaning behind the house system. It was not designed to separate people permanently, but to highlight different strengths that, when brought together, created something more balanced. In this way, the influence of Hogwarts extended far beyond its grounds. It shaped not just how magic was taught, but how it was understood, applied, and integrated into everyday life. The houses remained a quiet presence, not always visible, but always present in the way individuals approached the world around them. And over time, this presence became less about division and more about perspective, a reminder that there was never just one way to think, one way to act, or one way to define what it meant to be a witch or wizard. Over time, the house system came to influence something even more subtle than behavior or identity. It began to shape expectations before a student had the chance to define themselves. The moment a name was called and the sorting hat made its decision, a set of assumptions often followed. These assumptions were not formally taught, but they were understood through repetition, observation, and the culture that had formed around each house. A newly sorted student would quickly become aware of these expectations. They would notice how others reacted to their house placement, the way certain traits were associated with them, and how those traits were reflected in everyday interactions. This awareness could be quiet at first, something observed rather than questioned, but over time, it became more noticeable. For some students, these expectations felt natural. They aligned easily with the qualities their house represented, and the environment around them reinforced what already felt true. The house became a place where their existing tendencies were supported, where their strengths were recognized, and where their actions fit within a familiar pattern. For others, the experience was less straightforward. A student might find themselves placed in a house that did not immediately reflect how they saw themselves. They might feel out of place at first, unsure of how they fit within the expectations that surrounded them. In these cases, the house system did not provide immediate clarity, but rather a challenge. It asked them to consider parts of themselves they had not fully understood yet. This process of adjustment was not always visible. It often happened gradually, through small interactions and repeated experiences. A student might begin by observing those around them, learning how others approached situations, and slowly adapting their own behavior. Over time, this could lead to a shift in perspective, where the qualities associated with their house became more familiar and eventually more integrated into their sense of self. At the same time, the presence of expectations could also create pressure. Students might feel the need to demonstrate the traits associated with their house, even when those traits did not come naturally to them. A Gryffindor might feel expected to act bravely in situations where they would prefer caution. A Ravenclaw might feel pressure to always have the right answer. A Hufflepuff might feel the need to remain consistently reliable, even when they struggled. A Slytherin might feel expected to pursue ambition, even when their priorities lay elsewhere. This pressure was not always imposed directly. It often came from within, shaped by the desire to belong and to meet the standards that seemed to define their house. Over time, these internal expectations could become as influential as the external ones, guiding behavior in ways that were not always consciously chosen. Despite this, the system also allowed for growth. Expectations, while influential, were not fixed limits. Students could meet them in their own way, interpret them differently, or gradually expand beyond them. A student who initially struggled to fit within their house might find their own approach, blending different qualities in a way that felt more authentic. The sorting hat itself seemed to anticipate this possibility. Its decisions were not based solely on what a student was at that moment, but on what they might become. This meant that the house system was not simply about categorization, it was about direction. It provided a framework within which students could develop, even if that development did not follow a predictable path. Over time, this balance between expectation and individuality became one of the defining aspects of the Hogwarts experience. The houses created structure, but they did not completely restrict growth. They offered guidance, but they also allowed for variation. This combination made the system both stable and flexible, capable of maintaining its identity while adapting to each new generation of students. What emerged was a pattern that repeated itself year after year. Students arrived with their own sense of who they were placed into a house that reflected part of that identity, and then spent their time at Hogwarts, navigating the space between expectation and personal growth. Some aligned closely with their house from the beginning, others grew into it over time, and some moved beyond it entirely, shaping their own identity in ways that could not be fully contained by a single set of traits. In this way, the house system continued to evolve, not through changes to its structure, but through the experiences of those who lived within it. Each student contributed to its meaning, reinforcing certain ideas while quietly reshaping others. And through this ongoing process, the system remained both consistent and open, defined by its past but continuously influenced by the present. As the years passed, the idea of house identity began to extend beyond personality and expectation into something more enduring. It became part of history. Each house carried not only the values of its founder, but also the actions, choices, and reputations of the students who had come before. Over time, these accumulated into a kind of legacy, one that new students would inherit the moment they were sorted. This legacy was not written in a single place. It existed in stories, in records, and in the way people spoke about the past. Certain names became closely tied to their houses, remembered for what they had achieved, what they had failed to do, and how they had influenced the world around them. These individuals did not represent their houses completely, but they contributed to how those houses were perceived. A house that produced many well-known witches and wizards might be seen as more influential, its reputation strengthened by visible success. At the same time, moments of failure or controversy could also become part of that identity, shaping how others viewed the house in the present. This meant that the legacy of each house was not entirely controlled by its founder's original vision. It was shaped continuously by those who belonged to it. For students arriving at Hogwarts, this legacy could feel distant at first. The names and events associated with their house were part of a larger history, something they learnt about rather than experienced directly. But as they spent more time within their house, that history became more relevant. It influenced how they were seen by others and how they understood their place within the school. In some cases, students felt a sense of pride in this connection. Being part of a house with a strong history could create a feeling of continuity, as though they were contributing to something that extended far beyond their own time at Hogwarts. This sense of belonging to a larger story could be motivating, encouraging students to live up to the reputation associated with their house. At the same time, legacy could also create pressure. Expectations were not only shaped by the present environment, but also by the past. A student might feel that they needed to match the achievements of those who came before them, or avoid repeating mistakes that had become part of their house's history. This added another layer to the experience of being sorted, one that was not immediately visible, but gradually became more significant. The relationship between individual and legacy was not always straightforward. Some students embraced it fully, allowing it to guide their actions and decisions. Others resisted it, choosing to define themselves independently of what their house was known for. Both approaches existed within the system, reflecting the balance between continuity and change. Over time, this interaction between past and present became one of the ways the house system remained active. It was not just maintained through tradition, but through the ongoing contributions of students. Each new generation added to the story, reinforcing certain aspects while subtly altering others. The identity of a house was never entirely fixed, because it was always being shaped by those within it. This process also affected how houses related to one another. Legacy played a role in rivalry as much as in identity. Long-standing perceptions, based on historical patterns, influenced how students viewed other houses. These perceptions could persist even when individual experiences suggested something different, creating a gap between expectation and reality. Despite this, the system allowed for change. A student could challenge the assumptions associated with their house simply by acting differently. Over time, enough of these individual actions could shift the broader perception, altering the legacy itself. This meant that while history was influential, it was not unchangeable. The founders had not created a static system. They had created something that could carry forward their ideas, but also evolve beyond them. Legacy was a natural result of this, a way of preserving the past while still allowing for growth. It connected students to those who came before them, but it did not fully determine who they would become. In this way, the houses functioned as more than categories or communities. They became ongoing narratives, shaped by countless individuals over time. Each student entered that narrative at a different point, contributed to it in their own way, and eventually left it for others to continue. What remained consistent was the presence of that connection, a sense that being part of a house meant being part of something larger than a single moment or a single person. And while that connection could be interpreted in many different ways, it continued to influence how students understood both their past and their place within the present. As the system continued to function across generations, one of its most consistent features was also one of its least questioned. The idea that a single moment, early in a student's life, could influence so much of what followed. The sorting ceremony happened quickly, often within minutes, yet its effects extended across years of learning, relationships, and personal development. At first, this seemed efficient. A decision was made, a place was assigned, and a structure was immediately established. Students knew where they belonged, who they would live with, and which group they were part of. This clarity removed uncertainty, allowing them to settle into the rhythm of the school without needing to define their role from the beginning. But over time, the simplicity of this moment revealed a deeper complexity. A student at the beginning of their journey was not a complete reflection of who they would become. Their understanding of themselves was still developing, shaped by experiences that had yet to occur. This raised a quiet question. Could a single decision, made so early, truly account for the full range of a person's potential? The Sorting Hat attempted to address this by considering not just present traits, but future possibilities. It looked for patterns, tendencies, and even preferences that might guide a student's development. In doing so, it aimed to place them in an environment that would encourage growth. But even with this consideration, the outcome remained a fixed assignment. Once sorted, a student did not move between houses. The decision was not revisited, and the structure did not change. This permanence created stability, but it also meant that any misalignment between a student and their house would need to be navigated rather than corrected. Growth would happen within the assigned framework rather than through a change of it. For many students, this was not a problem. They adapted to their environment, found their place within their house, and developed in ways that aligned with its values. Over time, the initial decision felt less like a limitation and more like a natural fit. The house became part of their identity, something that reflected who they had become. For others, the experience was more complicated. A student might feel that certain aspects of their personality were not fully represented by their house. They might recognize qualities in themselves that aligned more closely with another house, creating a sense of distance between their assigned identity and their personal understanding of who they were. In these cases, the system required a different kind of adjustment. Rather than changing the structure, the student would need to reinterpret it. They might focus on aspects of their house that resonated with them, or they might quietly expand their identity beyond the boundaries suggested by the sorting. This process was not always visible, but it was an important part of how individuals navigated the system. The permanence of sorting also influenced how others perceived these differences. Because the system did not allow for reassignment, the expectation remained that each student belonged where they had been placed. This made it less likely for others to question the decision, even when it did not fully align with what they observed. Over time, this reinforced the idea that the sorting was definitive, even if the reality was more flexible. Despite this, the system endured because of its overall effectiveness. It provided a clear structure, a sense of belonging, and a framework for development that worked for the majority of students. The limitations it introduced were often balanced by the stability it created, allowing the school to function consistently across generations. What remained beneath this structure, however, was the recognition that identity was not fixed. A student could grow, change, and develop in ways that went beyond their initial classification. The house system did not prevent this, but it did shape how that growth was experienced. It provided a starting point, but not a final definition. This balance between permanence and possibility became one of the most enduring aspects of Hogwarts. The sorting decision was never revisited, but its meaning could evolve over time. A student might begin their journey unsure of where they fit, only to find clarity later, or they might begin with certainty, only to discover new aspects of themselves that did not align with their expectations. In this way, the moment of sorting remained important, but it was not absolute. It marked the beginning of a process, not its conclusion. And within that process, each student navigated their own path, shaped by their house, but not entirely defined by it. As the structure of the houses settled into something consistent, another layer of the system began to reveal itself. It was not part of the official design, and it was rarely discussed directly, but it influenced how the houses were understood over time. This was the idea of comparison, not just between students, but between the houses themselves. Each house represented a different set of values, but those values did not exist in isolation. They were constantly being measured against one another, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly. Courage was compared to intelligence, intelligence to loyalty, loyalty to ambition, and ambition back to courage. These comparisons were not part of any formal lesson, but they became part of how students interpreted the system. In some ways, this created a sense of balance. No single house could claim to represent everything. Each one held a piece of a larger whole, and together they formed a more complete picture of what a witch or wizard could be. This idea was present in the way the school functioned, even if it was not always stated directly. At the same time, comparison could lead to hierarchy. Certain traits were sometimes seen as more visible or more immediately impressive than others. Acts of bravery could be noticed quickly, while consistency and patience might take longer to be recognized. Intelligence could be measured in results, while loyalty was often understood through experience. Ambition could lead to clear outcomes, while its methods might be interpreted differently depending on perspective. These differences in visibility influenced how the houses were perceived. Some were associated with dramatic moments, others with steady progress. Some were linked to individual achievement, others to collective effort. Over time, these patterns shaped the way students and even the wider wizarding world viewed each house. Despite this, the system itself did not place one house above another. The founders had designed it as a set of parallel paths, not a ranking. Each house offered a different approach to the same goal, the development of magical ability and personal understanding. The comparisons that emerged were the result of interpretation, not intention. Students navigated this in their own way. Some embraced the comparisons, using them as motivation to prove the value of their house. Others ignored them, focusing instead on their own growth and the immediate environment around them. Both responses existed within the system, reflecting the range of perspectives that the houses allowed. The presence of comparison also influenced how students saw themselves. They were not only part of a house, but part of a system where that house was constantly being understood in relation to others. This added another layer to identity, one that extended beyond individual traits into a broader context. Over time, this dynamic became part of the culture of Hogwarts. It appeared in conversations, in competitions, and in the way achievements were discussed. It shaped expectations, not just of what a student should be, but of how that student's qualities fit within a larger framework. And yet, even within this structure, the original balance remained. No house existed independently, and no single set of values could fully define what it meant to be a witch or wizard. The comparisons, while influential, did not change the underlying purpose of the system. They simply added another dimension to how it was experienced. What became clear was that the houses were not just different from one another, they were connected through those differences. Each one highlighted aspects that the others did not emphasize, creating a system where multiple perspectives could exist at once. In this way, comparison did not just divide the houses, it also linked them. It created a continuous interaction, a way of understanding each house not only by what it was, but by how it related to the others. And through that interaction, the full complexity of the system became more visible, even if it was never fully defined. As the years moved forward, the house system began to shape something that was less visible than identity or competition, but just as influential. It began to affect how students made decisions, not only in large moments, but in small, everyday choices that gradually defined how they approached the world. This influence did not come from direct instruction. No one told a student to act a certain way simply because of their house. Instead, it developed through repeated patterns. The environment of each house encouraged certain responses, certain priorities, and certain ways of thinking. Over time, these patterns became familiar, and familiarity made them easier to follow. A student in Gryffindor might begin to lean toward action when faced with uncertainty. Even in situations where waiting might seem safer, the instinct to step forward could feel more natural. This was not always a conscious decision. It was often the result of being surrounded by others who approached challenges in the same way, reinforcing that pattern over time. In Ravenclaw, the process looked different. Decision-making often involved reflection. A student might pause to consider possibilities, to examine details, and to understand the situation before acting. This approach valued clarity and precision, encouraging students to think through their choices rather than respond immediately. Hufflepuff introduced another perspective. Decisions were often shaped by consideration for others. A student might think about the impact of their actions, not just on themselves, but on those around them. Reliability and fairness became guiding factors, influencing choices in ways that prioritized stability and trust. In Slytherin, the approach was often more strategic. Decisions were shaped by long-term thinking, with attention given to outcomes and opportunities. A student might consider not just what to do in the moment, but how that decision would affect future possibilities. This created a sense of direction, where choices were connected to broader goals. These different approaches did not exist in isolation. Students encountered situations where multiple perspectives could apply, and they were not limited to only one way of thinking. However, the environment of their house often influenced which approach felt most natural, especially in moments where there was little time to reflect. Over time, these patterns became part of how students understood themselves. They began to recognize their own tendencies, noticing how they responded to challenges, how they approached problems, and how they interacted with others. This awareness was not always explicit, but it developed gradually through experience. At the same time, the presence of different houses meant that students were constantly exposed to alternative ways of thinking. A Gryffindor might observe a Ravenclaw taking time to analyze a situation, or a Hufflepuff maintaining consistency in a difficult moment, or a Slytherin planning several steps ahead. These observations introduced variety into the decision-making process, even if they did not immediately change behavior. This interaction between different approaches added depth to the system. It showed that no single method was always correct, and that different situations might require different responses. While each house emphasized certain tendencies, the broader environment of Hogwarts allowed students to see beyond those boundaries. Despite this, the influence of the houses remained strong. In moments of uncertainty, students often returned to what felt familiar, to the patterns that had been reinforced over time. These instincts, shaped by environment and experience, guided decisions in ways that were not always fully conscious. What emerged was a subtle but consistent effect. The house system did not just categorize students or shape their identity. It influenced how they thought, how they responded, and how they navigated the world around them. It became part of the process through which decisions were made, even in situations that had nothing to do with the school itself. And yet, this influence was not fixed. Students could recognize their own patterns and choose to act differently. They could adopt new approaches, learn from others, and gradually expand the way they made decisions. The system provided a foundation, but it did not remove the possibility of change. In this way, the house system continued to function as both a guide and a starting point. It shaped tendencies, but it did not control them entirely. It influenced decisions, but it did not define them completely. And through this balance, it remained a central part of how students developed, both within Hogwarts and beyond it. As the influence of the houses extended into decision-making and identity, another aspect of the system became more apparent over time. It shaped not only how students saw themselves, but how they understood success. The idea of what it meant to do well, to improve, or to achieve something meaningful began to take on slightly different forms, depending on the environment of each house. At Hogwarts, success was not defined in a single way. Academic performance, skill in magic, and participation in school activities all contributed to how a student was evaluated. But beyond these measurable factors, there were quieter definitions of success that developed within each house. These were not written rules, but shared understandings that guided how achievements were recognized. In Gryffindor, success often appeared in moments of action. It could be seen in a student stepping forward when others hesitated, or in taking responsibility in a difficult situation. These moments did not always result in immediate reward, but they were noticed and valued within the house. Over time, this created a sense that success was tied not just to outcomes, but to the willingness to act. Ravenclaw approached success through understanding. A student who grasped a complex idea, who solved a problem through careful thought, or who explored a subject beyond what was required, would find that effort recognized. In this environment, success was often quieter, built through reflection and curiosity rather than visible action. It was measured in clarity, in insight, and in the ability to see connections that others might overlook. Hufflepuff defined success through consistency. It was not always about a single achievement, but about sustained effort over time. Completing tasks reliably, supporting others, and maintaining a steady approach to challenges were all seen as meaningful contributions. This created a sense that success could be gradual, something built step by step rather than achieved in a single moment. Slytherin, in contrast, often connected success to results. Achieving a goal, advancing in a particular direction, or demonstrating the ability to influence outcomes were all valued. This did not necessarily mean acting without consideration, but it did emphasize the importance of progress and effectiveness. Success was often seen as something that could be planned, pursued, and ultimately attained. These different perspectives did not exist in isolation. Students were aware of how other houses approached success, and this awareness sometimes led to comparison. What was valued in one house might not be emphasized in another, creating different standards that could be difficult to align. A moment of quiet understanding might go unnoticed in one context, while a visible achievement might be highlighted in another. Despite these differences, the system allowed for multiple forms of success to exist at the same time. No single definition was presented as complete. Instead, each house offered a particular lens, a way of recognizing achievement that reflected its underlying values. This diversity created a broader understanding of what it meant to succeed, even if it was not always fully acknowledged. For students, navigating these different definitions could be both helpful and challenging. It allowed them to find recognition in areas that aligned with their strengths, but it could also create uncertainty when those strengths did not match the expectations of others. A student might excel in one context while feeling overlooked in another, depending on how success was defined. Over time, this experience contributed to a more complex understanding of achievement. Students began to see that success was not fixed and that it could be interpreted in different ways. This realization did not remove the influence of the houses, but it did add a layer of perspective, making it possible to see beyond a single definition. The house system, in this sense, did not impose a single standard. It presented multiple ones, each shaped by the values of its founder and the traditions that followed. These standards existed alongside one another, sometimes aligning, sometimes contrasting, but always part of the same environment. What emerged from this was not a single path to success, but a range of possibilities. Students could move within that range, drawing from different perspectives as they developed. They could find their own way of understanding achievement, influenced by their house, but not entirely limited by it. And in this process, the original purpose of the system continued to take shape, not just to teach magic, but to offer different ways of approaching it, different ways of thinking, acting, and defining what it meant to grow. As students moved further into their time at Hogwarts, the influence of the houses began to appear in something even more gradual. It shaped how they changed over time, not just in what they learned, but in how they developed as individuals, often in ways that were difficult to notice while they were happening. Growth at Hogwarts did not follow a single pattern. It was shaped by lessons, experiences, and relationships, but also by the environment of each house. The values that surrounded a student did not remain separate from them. They became part of the way change unfolded, guiding it in certain directions while leaving other possibilities less explored. In Gryffindor, growth often came through experience. Students were encouraged, directly or indirectly, to face situations that challenged them. This did not always mean dramatic moments. It could be something as simple as speaking up, trying something unfamiliar, or stepping into uncertainty. Over time, these repeated experiences built confidence, not all at once, but gradually, through action. Ravenclaw followed a quieter path. Growth was often linked to understanding, to the process of learning something deeply enough that it changed the way a student thought. This might happen through study, through discussion, or through independent exploration. The change was not always visible, but it was consistent, shaping perspective in subtle ways that accumulated over time. In Hufflepuff, growth was steady and continuous. It did not rely on a single moment or realization, but on the accumulation of effort. Students developed through repetition, through consistency, and through the willingness to continue even when progress felt slow. This created a form of change that was less noticeable in the short term, but often more stable in the long term. Slytherin approached growth with intention. Students were often aware of where they wanted to go, and their development reflected that awareness. They learned to adapt, to refine their approach, and to move toward their goals with increasing precision. This did not mean that growth was always smooth, but it was often directed, shaped by a sense of purpose. These different approaches did not prevent overlap. A Gryffindor could learn through reflection, a Ravenclaw through experience, a Hufflepuff through ambition, and a Slytherin through consistency. The houses emphasized certain paths, but they did not exclude others. Growth remained a complex process, influenced by many factors at once. What the houses provided was a starting point. They created an environment where certain forms of development were more likely to occur, simply because they were supported and encouraged. Over time, this shaped the direction of growth, even if it did not determine it completely. For many students, this process was gradual enough that it went unnoticed. Change did not happen all at once. It appeared in small shifts, in habits, in reactions, in the way they approached situations that once felt unfamiliar. Only later, often after leaving Hogwarts, would these changes become more visible. At the same time, growth was not always aligned with expectation. A student might develop in ways that did not match the traditional view of their house. They might discover strengths that were not emphasized in their environment, or question values that had once seemed clear. These moments did not disrupt the system, but they added to its complexity. The presence of different houses allowed for this variation. It created a space where multiple paths could exist, even if each house emphasized one more than the others. Students could move within that space, drawing from different influences as they developed. Over time, this created a pattern that repeated across generations. Students entered Hogwarts with a certain sense of who they were placed into an environment that shaped their development, and gradually changed in ways that reflected both their surroundings and their own choices. The house system did not control this process, but it guided it. It provided a framework within which growth could occur, influencing its direction without fully determining its outcome. And through this balance, it remained a central part of how students changed, not just in what they learned, but in who they became. As time moved forward, the differences between the houses began to reveal something else that was not immediately obvious. They shaped how students responded to difficulty, not just in moments of clear challenge, but in quieter situations where uncertainty, failure, or pressure required a response that was not always visible from the outside. Difficulty at Hogwarts took many forms. It could be academic, social, or personal. A spell that did not work, a concept that was difficult to understand, a misunderstanding with another student, or a moment of doubt that had no clear cause. These experiences were shared across all houses, but the way they were approached often reflected the environment in which a student developed. In Gryffindor, difficulty was often met with action. A student might respond by trying again, pushing forward even when the outcome was uncertain. This approach did not always lead to immediate success, but it created a sense that progress could be made through persistence in the moment. The willingness to continue, even without certainty, became a defining response. Ravenclaw approached difficulty through analysis. When something did not work, the response was often to understand why. A student might revisit the problem, examine its details, and attempt to find a clearer path forward. This method required patience, but it allowed for a deeper understanding of the challenge itself, often leading to more precise solutions over time. In Hufflepuff, difficulty was met with endurance. The focus was not on immediate resolution, but on steady effort. A student might continue working through a problem, accepting that progress could be slow, but trusting that consistency would eventually lead to improvement. This created a sense of resilience, where challenges were not avoided, but worked through gradually. Slytherin, in contrast, often approached difficulty with adaptation. If one method did not succeed, another would be considered. A student might adjust their strategy, look for alternative paths, or reconsider their approach entirely. This flexibility allowed for movement even when obstacles appeared, emphasizing the importance of finding a way forward rather than remaining fixed in one method. These different responses were not exclusive. Students could, and often did, combine them. A Gryffindor might reflect before acting, a Ravenclaw might push forward despite uncertainty, a Hufflepuff might adapt their approach, and a Slytherin might persist through repetition. The houses influenced tendencies, but they did not limit possibility. What they did provide was a sense of familiarity. In moments of difficulty, students often returned to what felt natural, to the patterns that had been reinforced over time. These patterns shaped how challenges were understood, whether as something to confront, to analyze, to endure, or to navigate strategically. At the same time, exposure to other approaches created opportunities for change. Watching how others responded to difficulty could introduce new ways of thinking. A student might recognize the value in a method they had not considered before, gradually incorporating it into their own approach. This interaction added depth to the experience of facing challenges. It showed that difficulty did not have a single solution, and that different perspectives could lead to different outcomes. The house system, in this sense, did not just shape responses. It created a range of responses that existed together, allowing students to learn from one another. Over time, this influenced how students understood failure. It was no longer simply an obstacle, but part of a process, a moment that could be approached in different ways, each offering its own form of progress. This understanding did not remove the difficulty itself, but it changed how it was experienced. The houses, through their differences, contributed to this shift. They provided multiple ways of engaging with challenge, each emphasizing a different aspect of resilience. Whether through action, understanding, consistency, or adaptation, students developed the ability to move through difficulty in ways that reflected both their environment and their own choices. And in this process, the original purpose of the system continued to unfold, not just to sort students, but to guide how they engaged with the world, especially when it became uncertain. As students continued through their years at Hogwarts, another pattern became visible in a quieter way. The houses did not just shape how students acted or responded. They influenced how students related to one another over time, not only in friendships, but in trust, understanding, and the way connections were formed and maintained. Relationships at Hogwarts developed within a structured environment. Students spent most of their time among those in their own house, sharing living spaces, routines, and responsibilities. This proximity created familiarity, and familiarity often became the foundation for trust. Over time, this trust grew into something more stable, shaped by repeated interaction and shared experience. In Gryffindor, relationships were often built through shared moments of action, facing challenges together, supporting one another in uncertain situations, and responding collectively to events created strong bonds. These connections were often immediate, formed through experience rather than gradual development. Trust could emerge quickly, reinforced by a sense of standing together in moments that required it. Ravenclaw approached relationships through understanding. Connections were often formed through conversation, shared ideas, and a mutual interest in learning. These relationships might develop more gradually, built through discussion and observation rather than immediate experience. Trust came from recognizing how another person thought, how they approached problems, and how they contributed to a shared understanding. In Hufflepuff, relationships were grounded in consistency. Trust developed through reliability, through small, repeated actions that demonstrated support over time. These connections were often steady, built on the expectation that others would be present, dependable, and fair. This created a sense of security within the house, where relationships were maintained through continuity rather than intensity. Slytherin, in contrast, often approached relationships with a sense of awareness. Trust was not given immediately, but developed through observation and experience. Connections were shaped by an understanding of mutual benefit, shared goals, or aligned perspectives. This did not make relationships less meaningful, but it did make them more deliberate, built through careful consideration rather than assumption. These different approaches did not prevent interaction between houses. Students worked together, attended the same classes, and, at times, formed connections that crossed house boundaries. These relationships often required a different kind of understanding, one that moved beyond the familiar patterns of a single house. In these situations, differences became more visible. A student might encounter a way of forming relationships that felt unfamiliar, shaped by values they had not prioritized before. This could create distance at first, but it could also lead to a broader understanding of how connections could exist in different forms. Over time, this exposure allowed students to adapt. They could learn to recognize trust in ways that differed from their own experience, to understand relationships that were built on different foundations. This did not replace their original approach, but it expanded it, adding depth to how they interacted with others. The house system, in this sense, created both closeness and distance. It strengthened bonds within houses, while also highlighting differences between them. But within that structure, it also allowed for movement. Students were not limited to one type of relationship, even if they were most familiar with it. As years passed, this balance became more natural. Students learned to navigate both familiarity and difference, forming connections that reflected both their environment and their own choices. They could rely on the stability of their house, while also engaging with others in ways that extended beyond it. What emerged was not a single way of building relationships, but a range of possibilities. Each house contributed its own perspective, its own method of connection, and its own understanding of trust. Together, these approaches created a more complex social environment, one that reflected the broader diversity of the wizarding world. And within that environment, students learned something that extended beyond their time at Hogwarts, that relationships, like identity, could take many forms, that trust could be built in different ways, and that understanding those differences was just as important as finding similarity. As students moved closer to the end of their time at Hogwarts, the influence of the houses began to shift in a subtle way. It was no longer only about development within the school. It became something that prepared them for what came after. The house system, which had shaped identity, decisions, and relationships, now began to influence how students approached the transition beyond Hogwarts. Leaving the school meant entering a world without the same structure. There were no common rooms, no house points, and no daily reinforcement of house identity in the same visible way, and yet, the patterns developed within that system did not disappear. They remained, shaping how students viewed their future and how they prepared for it. For some, this transition felt natural. The values they had developed within their house translated easily into the broader world. A Gryffindor might approach new opportunities with the same willingness to act, even when the outcome was uncertain. A Ravenclaw might continue to seek understanding, applying their ability to analyze and learn in new contexts. A Hufflepuff might rely on consistency and reliability, building trust in environments that required long-term commitment. A Slytherin might move forward with a clear sense of direction, focusing on goals and the steps needed to achieve them. For others, the transition required adjustment. Without the structure of Hogwarts, the distinctions between houses became less defined. Students encountered people who did not fit neatly into the patterns they had come to recognize. This required a broader perspective, one that went beyond the familiar categories and allowed for a more flexible understanding of others. The house system, in this sense, functioned as preparation rather than limitation. It provided a framework through which students could develop certain tendencies, but it did not confine them to those tendencies once they left. Instead, it gave them a starting point, something to build from as they entered a more complex environment. At the same time, the absence of structure highlighted something that had always been present. The houses were never complete definitions of identity. They were one part of a larger process, one influence among many. Outside of Hogwarts, this became more visible. Students were no longer primarily seen through the lens of their house, but through their actions, their choices, and their interactions. This shift did not remove the influence of the houses, but it placed it within a broader context. A former student might still recognize the traits associated with their house in themselves, but they would also see how those traits interacted with others, how they adapted, and how they changed over time. In this way, the house system revealed its long-term purpose. It was not meant to define a student permanently, but to guide their early development. It provided structure at a time when structure was needed, allowing students to grow within a supportive environment before moving into a world that required greater independence. The transition also created a moment of reflection. Students could look back on their time at Hogwarts and consider how their house had influenced them. They might recognize patterns in their behavior, tendencies in their thinking, and ways of interacting that had developed gradually over time. This awareness did not always lead to immediate change, but it offered an understanding of how those influences had shaped them. For some, This meant embracing those influences more fully. For others, it meant adjusting them, adapting to new circumstances in ways that felt more aligned with their evolving identity. Both responses were part of the same process, reflecting the flexibility that had always existed within the system. As more generations passed through Hogwarts, this pattern repeated itself. Students entered, developed within the framework of their house, and then carried those experiences into the wider world. The houses remained part of their history, but not the entirety of their identity. What continued to matter was not the label itself, but what had been learned within it. The habits, perspectives, and approaches that had been reinforced over time became part of how individuals navigated the world, even when the original structure was no longer present. And through this process, the house system extended its influence far beyond the school, not as a rigid classification, but as a foundation, a way of beginning that continued to shape what followed, even as the context around it changed. As the influence of the houses extended beyond Hogwarts, another detail began to stand out more clearly over time. The system had always emphasized difference, but it also depended on something less visible. It depended on balance, not just between the houses themselves, but between the values they represented and the way those values interacted with one another. Each house highlighted a particular way of approaching the world. Courage, intelligence, loyalty, and ambition were not isolated qualities. They existed together, often within the same individual, even if one was emphasized more than the others. The structure of Hogwarts separated these qualities into distinct groups, but it did not remove their connection. This connection became more noticeable in situations where a single approach was not enough. A moment might require action, but also understanding. It might require consistency, but also adaptation. In these situations, the limitations of relying on one perspective became clear, and the value of combining them became more apparent. Within the school, this balance was present in the way students interacted. Different houses approached the same situation in different ways, and through those differences, a more complete understanding could emerge. A problem examined from multiple perspectives often revealed details that would not have been visible from a single point of view. At the same time, the structure of the houses sometimes made this balance more difficult to achieve. The emphasis on identity and belonging could encourage students to remain within familiar patterns, relying on the approaches that felt most natural to them. This created a tension between comfort and adaptability, between staying within known boundaries and exploring beyond them. Despite this, the system did not prevent balance from developing. It allowed for interaction, for observation, and for gradual change. Students could learn from one another, not by abandoning their own perspective, but by recognizing the value in others. This process was not immediate, but it was consistent, unfolding over time through experience. The founders themselves had created this possibility, even if it was not fully intentional. By bringing together different philosophies, they ensured that no single approach would dominate completely. The presence of multiple houses created a system where difference was not only accepted, but necessary. Over time, this necessity became part of how the wizarding world functioned. Different situations required different responses, and those responses often reflected the values associated with the houses. But the most effective outcomes were often the result of combining those values, rather than relying on one alone. This idea did not always appear in a clear or structured way. it was often understood through experience rather than explanation. Students would encounter situations where their usual approach was not enough, and in those moments, they would recognize the need for something more. The house system, in this sense, did not just create difference, it created the conditions for understanding difference. It provided a framework in which multiple perspectives could exist, interact, and influence one another. Through this interaction, balance became possible, even if it was not always fully achieved. What emerged was a system that was both divided and connected. Each house maintained its own identity, but none existed independently. They were part of a larger structure, one that depended on the presence of all of them to function as intended. And within that structure, students learned something that extended beyond any single house. That strength did not come from one quality alone, but from the ability to recognize and integrate multiple ones. That understanding, though subtle, became one of the most lasting effects of the system, shaping how individuals approached the world long after they left Hogwarts. As the system continued across generations, one detail remained consistent, even as everything else shifted around it. The sorting hat never changed its role. It continued to sit at the center of the process, unchanged in form, but constantly active in purpose. Each year, it was placed on the head of a new group of students, and each year, it made decisions that would shape their experience in ways they could not fully understand at that moment. The hat itself carried something unusual. It was not simply a tool that followed a fixed set of rules. It contained the thinking of the founders, preserved within it in a way that allowed it to respond to each student individually. This meant that no two sorting decisions were exactly the same. Even if the outcome appeared similar, the process behind it was always specific to the person being sorted. When a student placed the hat on their head, the moment often felt brief from the outside. But within that moment, something more complex was happening. The hat listened, observed, and interpreted. It considered traits, tendencies, and sometimes even thoughts that the student had not fully expressed. It looked for patterns, not just in what was obvious, but in what might develop over time. This process introduced a level of unpredictability into the system. While the houses had clear identities, the path that led a student to one of them was not always straightforward. Two students with similar abilities might be placed in different houses, depending on how the hat understood their potential. This made the system consistent in structure, but flexible in application. At the same time, the presence of choice remained a subtle but important part of the process. The hat did not ignore the preferences of the student. In some cases, it responded directly to them, adjusting its decision based on what the student wanted or feared. This created a moment where identity was not only observed, but also expressed. This balance between judgment and choice allowed the system to adapt without changing its form. The hat continued to represent the founders, but it also responded to the individual in front of it. This made the sorting process both stable and personal, maintaining continuity while allowing for variation. Over time, the hat itself became part of the identity of Hogwarts. It was not just a mechanism, but a symbol. It represented the connection between the past and the present, carrying the intentions of the founders into each new generation. Its presence at the start of every school year reinforced the idea that the system was ongoing, not something that had been decided once and then left unchanged. Students, even before being sorted, were often aware of the hat's significance. They understood that it would decide where they belonged, and that this decision would shape their experience. This awareness added weight to the moment, even if the process itself remained quiet and contained. Despite its importance, the hat did not explain its decisions fully. It offered a result, but not always a complete reasoning. This left space for interpretation, allowing students to reflect on their placement over time. The meaning of the decision could change as they developed, revealing aspects of themselves that had not been clear at the beginning. The continued use of the sorting hat ensured that the system remained connected to its origins. It preserved the founders' influence without requiring direct involvement, allowing their ideas to persist across centuries. At the same time, its ability to respond to individuals ensured that the system did not become rigid or outdated. What remained constant was the moment itself. The quiet pause, the decision, and the immediate shift from uncertainty to belonging. It happened the same way each year, yet it never repeated in exactly the same form. In this way, the sorting hat became more than a tool of organization. It became the point where past intention and present identity met. A single moment that carried both continuity and change, shaping the experience of each student while maintaining the structure that defined Hogwarts. As the years passed and the system continued without interruption, something else began to emerge alongside it. It was not part of the structure itself, but it existed because of it. This was the idea of tradition, not the original intentions of the founders, but the habits, rituals, and repeated actions that developed over time within each house. Tradition did not appear all at once. It formed gradually, built from small moments that were repeated often enough to become familiar. A way of celebrating success, a way of responding to challenges, a way of interacting within the common room. These patterns were not written into any official rule, but they were passed down from one group of students to the next. Within Gryffindor, traditions often reflected energy and immediacy. Celebrations could be loud, victories shared openly, and moments of excitement embraced without hesitation. This created an environment where expression was encouraged, where students felt free to respond to events in a direct and visible way. Ravenclaw developed its own form of tradition, one that was quieter but no less consistent. Discussions, shared ideas, and the pursuit of knowledge became part of the rhythm of the house. Traditions formed around thinking, around exploration, and around the exchange of understanding. These patterns created a space where learning extended beyond formal lessons into everyday life. Hufflepuff traditions were often rooted in stability. They reflected consistency, fairness, and the quiet support that defined the house. These traditions were not always visible from the outside, but they were deeply felt within. They created a sense of continuity, where each new group of students entered an environment that felt familiar even before they fully understood it. Slytherin, in its own way, developed traditions that reflected awareness and intention. These were often less obvious, shaped by observation and shared understanding rather than open display. Traditions might appear in the way students supported one another, in the way they approached challenges, or in the quiet expectations that guided behavior within the house. These traditions reinforced the identities of the houses, but they also extended them. They added detail, creating layers that went beyond the original values of the founders. Over time, these patterns became part of how each house was experienced, influencing behavior, in ways that were not always consciously recognized. At the same time, tradition introduced continuity. Each new generation of students entered a system that already existed, shaped by those who had come before. They did not begin from nothing. Instead, they stepped into an environment that carried its own history, its own expectations, and its own way of functioning. Despite this continuity, tradition was not fixed. It could change, sometimes slowly, sometimes more noticeably. A new group of students might adjust a pattern, introduce something different, or reinterpret what had been passed down to them. These changes were often small, but over time, they accumulated, gradually shaping the evolution of each house. This balance between continuity and change allowed the system to remain stable without becoming static. The core structure of the houses remained the same, but the way they were experienced could shift, reflecting the influence of each new generation. Tradition also played a role in how students understood their place within the house. It connected them to those who had come before, creating a sense of belonging that extended beyond the present moment. At the same time, it allowed them to contribute, to add something of their own to the ongoing pattern. In this way, the house system became more than a framework for sorting or identity. It became a living structure, shaped not only by the founders, but by the countless students who passed through it. Each tradition, each repeated action added to that structure, reinforcing it while also allowing it to evolve. What remained consistent was the presence of that continuity, a sense that each student was part of something that existed before them and would continue after them. And within that continuity, the houses maintained their identity, not just through their values, but through the traditions that carried those values forward. As the structure of Hogwarts continued to hold across generations, another detail became more noticeable in a quiet and consistent way. The houses did not just influence identity, behavior, or tradition. They also shaped how students understood one another over time, not just within their own house, but across all four. Understanding did not always come immediately. At the beginning, students often saw other houses through simple impressions. These impressions were shaped by reputation, by stories, and by what could be observed from a distance. A house might seem defined by a single trait, and that trait might appear to explain everything about the people within it. But as time passed, those impressions began to change. Daily interaction, shared lessons, and repeated encounters revealed something more detailed. Students began to notice that the qualities associated with each house were not as narrow as they first appeared. Courage did not always look the same. Intelligence did not always follow a single pattern. Loyalty could take many forms, and ambition could be expressed in different ways. This shift in understanding often happened gradually. It was not the result of a single moment, but of many small observations. A student might notice someone acting in a way that did not match the expectation associated with their house. Over time, these observations accumulated, creating a more complex picture. In Gryffindor, for example, courage might appear not only in bold action, but in quiet persistence. In Ravenclaw, intelligence might be expressed not only through answers, but through questions. In Hufflepuff, loyalty might be shown not only through support, but through consistency in difficult moments. In Slytherin, ambition might be seen not only in personal advancement, but in careful planning and awareness. These variations did not change the core identities of the houses, but they expanded them. They showed that each value could exist in multiple forms, depending on the individual. This made the system more flexible than it might appear at first, allowing for a broader understanding of what each house represented. At the same time, this deeper understanding did not remove differences entirely. The houses remained distinct, each with its own emphasis and its own way of approaching situations. But those differences became less about separation and more about perspective. They represented different ways of seeing the same world, rather than completely separate ways of existing within it. This realization influenced how students interacted with one another. It made it easier to recognize value in approaches that were different from their own. A Gryffindor might come to appreciate the thoughtfulness of a Ravenclaw the reliability of a Hufflepuff the determination of a Slytherin, and a Slytherin the willingness of a Gryffindor to act. These moments of recognition did not always change behavior immediately, but they added depth to understanding. They allowed students to see beyond initial impressions and to recognize that each house offered something that the others did not emphasize. Over time, this contributed to a more balanced view of the system. The houses were no longer seen only in terms of difference, but also in terms of connection. Each one provided a perspective that, when understood alongside the others, created a more complete picture. This process did not eliminate rivalry or comparison. Those elements remained part of the system, shaped by tradition and identity. But alongside them, there was also a growing awareness that the houses were not isolated. They were part of a larger structure that depended on the presence of all of them. What emerged from this was a more nuanced understanding of what the houses represented. Not fixed categories, but evolving perspectives. Not complete definitions, but starting points for understanding. And through this gradual shift, students learned something that extended beyond Hogwarts. That understanding others required more than observation from a distance. It required time, interaction, and the willingness to see beyond first impressions. As the system continued to shape students in different ways, another effect became noticeable over time. The houses did not only influence how students saw others, they also shaped how students saw themselves in moments of uncertainty. Not in clear situations where choices felt obvious, but in quieter moments where direction was less defined. Uncertainty appeared in many forms at Hogwarts. It could be a decision without a clear outcome, a situation where different paths seemed equally possible, or a moment where a student was unsure of what was expected of them. These experiences were not limited to any one house, but the way they were approached often reflected the environment in which a student had developed. In Gryffindor, uncertainty was often met with movement. A student might choose a path and act, trusting that clarity would come through action. This approach did not remove doubt, but it reduced hesitation. It created a sense that progress could still be made, even without complete understanding. Ravenclaw approached uncertainty differently. Instead of moving immediately, a student might pause, gathering information, considering possibilities, and attempting to understand the situation more fully before deciding. This did not eliminate uncertainty, but it changed its role, turning it into something that could be explored rather than avoided. Hufflepuff responded to uncertainty with steadiness. A student might continue with what they knew, maintaining consistency even when the outcome was unclear. This approach provided stability, allowing them to move forward without needing to resolve every unknown detail at once. Slytherin, in contrast, often approached uncertainty with strategy. A student might consider different outcomes, weigh potential advantages, and choose a path that aligned with longer-term goals. This did not remove uncertainty, but it placed it within a broader context, making it part of a larger plan rather than an obstacle on its own. These approaches did not guarantee clarity. Uncertainty remained part of the experience, regardless of how it was addressed. But the presence of these different responses provided options, ways of engaging with situations that did not have a single clear answer. Over time, students became more aware of their own tendencies. They began to recognize how they reacted when faced with the unknown, noticing patterns in their behavior that reflected the influence of their house. This awareness was not always immediate, but it developed through repeated experience. At the same time, interaction between houses introduced alternative perspectives. A student might observe how someone else approached uncertainty in a different way and gradually consider whether that approach could apply to their own experience. This did not replace their original tendencies, but it expanded them, adding flexibility to how they responded. This process added depth to the system. It showed that uncertainty was not something to be resolved in a single way, but something that could be approached from multiple directions. Each house offered a perspective, and those perspectives existed together, providing a range of possibilities. Despite this, the familiarity of one's own house often remained the starting point. In moments where time was limited or pressure was high, students often returned to what felt most natural. These instincts, shaped over years, guided their actions, even when they were not consciously recognized. What the house system provided then was not certainty, but orientation. It did not remove the unknown, but it offered a way of facing it. A framework through which uncertainty could be understood, even if it could not be fully resolved. And within that framework, students developed something that extended beyond any single situation. The ability to move forward without complete clarity, to act, reflect, persist, or adapt, depending on what felt most appropriate. This ability did not belong to any one house, but it was shaped by all of them, reflecting the balance that existed within the system as a whole. As students spent more time within the structure of Hogwarts, another pattern became gradually visible. The houses did not only influence how students acted or thought, they shaped how students interpreted the actions of others. Not just what they saw, but how they understood it. Interpretation is rarely immediate or neutral. It is shaped by expectations, by past experience, and by the environment in which a person develops. At Hogwarts, the house system provided a framework through which many of these interpretations were formed. Students did not simply observe behavior. They often viewed it through the lens of what they believed each house represented. A bold action might be seen as courage when it came from a Gryffindor, but as something else when it came from another house. A carefully considered decision might be interpreted as intelligence in a Ravenclaw, but as hesitation in a different context. Loyalty in a Hufflepuff might be seen as consistency, while similar behavior in another house might not be recognized in the same way. Ambition in a Slytherin might be viewed as determination by some, and as something more complex by others. These interpretations were not fixed rules, but they were consistent enough to influence perception. Over time, students became aware of these patterns, even if they did not always question them directly. They began to recognize that the same action could be understood differently depending on who performed it. This created a subtle shift in how behavior was evaluated. It was no longer only about what happened, but also about who was involved. The house system, in this sense, added a layer of meaning to everyday interactions, shaping how those interactions were understood. At the same time, experience began to challenge these interpretations. As students interacted more closely, they encountered situations where the expected pattern did not apply. Someone might act in a way that did not align with their house's reputation, or a situation might reveal a quality that had not been immediately visible. These moments introduced complexity into the system. They showed that interpretation was not always accurate, and that relying too heavily on expectation could lead to misunderstanding. Over time, students began to adjust, refining how they understood others based on direct experience rather than assumption alone. This adjustment did not remove the influence of the houses, but it changed how that influence operated. It became less about fixed interpretation and more about a starting point, a way of forming an initial understanding that could then be expanded or corrected through interaction. The presence of different houses made this process more visible. It created variation, allowing students to see how the same behavior could be interpreted in different ways. This variation, while sometimes leading to misunderstanding, also provided an opportunity for deeper understanding over time. What emerged was a more layered way of seeing others. Students learned to recognize that behavior could not always be explained by a single trait or a single category. That actions had context, and that understanding that context required more than observation from a distance. The house system, through its structure, made this learning possible. It created a framework where interpretation could be examined, where expectations could be tested, and where understanding could develop gradually through experience. And within this process, students learned something that extended beyond the boundaries of Hogwarts. That perception is shaped not only by what is seen, but by how it is understood. And that understanding is not fixed, but something that can change over time, becoming more accurate as experience grows. As the system continued to shape perception and interaction, another aspect became more noticeable over time. The houses did not only influence how students understood others, they also affected how students understood change itself. Not just the change that happened around them, but the change that happened within them. Change at Hogwarts was constant, but often gradual. Students arrived with certain expectations, certain habits, and a developing sense of identity. Over the years, these elements shifted, sometimes in ways that were easy to recognize, and sometimes in ways that were more subtle. The house system did not stop this process. It shaped how it was experienced. In Gryffindor, change often appeared through action. A student might not notice their development until they found themselves responding differently to a situation than they would have before. A moment that once created hesitation might now lead to a decision, not because the uncertainty had disappeared, but because the response to it had changed. Ravenclaw approached change through understanding. Growth might become visible when a student realized that they could think about something in a new way, or when a concept that once seemed difficult became clear. This form of change was often internal, shaped by shifts in perspective rather than outward behavior. In Hufflepuff, change was steady and consistent. It was not always marked by a single moment, but by gradual improvement over time. A student might not see the difference immediately, but through repetition and persistence, they would find that something that once felt difficult had become manageable. Slytherin, in contrast, often recognized change through direction. A student might notice that their goals had become clearer, or that their approach to achieving them had become more refined. Growth was often measured in terms of progress, in the ability to move forward with greater precision than before. These different ways of understanding change did not limit what was possible. They provided different ways of recognizing it. A student might experience multiple forms of growth at once, even if one was more noticeable than the others. The house system highlighted certain aspects, but it did not exclude the rest. At the same time, the presence of different houses allowed students to observe change in others. They could see how different approaches led to different outcomes, how one person might develop through action while another developed through reflection. These observations added depth to their understanding, showing that change was not a single process, but a collection of many. Over time, this created a broader awareness of development. Students began to recognize that growth did not always follow a predictable path, and that it could appear in different forms depending on the individual. This understanding made it easier to see change, even when it was not immediately obvious. Despite this, the familiarity of one's own house often shaped how change was interpreted. Students were more likely to recognize forms of growth that aligned with their environment, while other forms might take longer to notice. This did not prevent change from occurring, but it influenced how it was understood. What the house system provided was a framework for recognizing development. It gave students a way to understand how they were changing, even if that understanding was not complete. It offered a perspective shaped by values and experience through which growth could be observed. And within that framework, something consistent remained. Change was always present, whether it was recognized immediately or only in hindsight. The houses did not create change, but they shaped how it was seen, how it was understood, and how it was integrated into a student's sense of identity. In this way, the system continued to influence not just what students became, but how they understood the process of becoming. As the system continued to operate across generations, another detail became more visible in a quiet and consistent way. The houses did not only shape identity, behavior, or understanding. They influenced how students remembered their time at Hogwarts. Not just what happened, but how those experiences were recalled and understood over time. Memory is not a fixed record. It is shaped by perspective, by emotion, and by the context in which events are experienced. At Hogwarts, the house system provided one of those contexts. It influenced which moments stood out, which experiences felt most significant, and how those experiences were interpreted later. For a Gryffindor, certain memories might center around moments of action, times when a decision had to be made quickly, when uncertainty was met with movement, or when standing forward felt necessary. These moments, whether large or small, could become defining points in how their time at Hogwarts was remembered. In Ravenclaw, memory often focused on understanding, a concept that became clear, a question that led to a new perspective, or a realization that changed the way something was seen. These moments might not always appear dramatic, but they carried a sense of clarity that made them lasting. Hufflepuff memories were often built through consistency, not a single event, but a series of moments that, when taken together, created a sense of stability and connection. Shared routines, steady progress, and the quiet presence of others became part of how their experience was recalled. Slytherin, in contrast, often remembered through direction. Moments where choices led to outcomes, where plans took shape, or where a path became clearer. These memories were often linked to progress, to movement towards something that extended beyond the immediate moment. These patterns did not define every memory, but they influenced which ones remained most prominent. Over time, they shaped the overall impression of what Hogwarts had been for each student. The same experience might be remembered differently depending on how it was interpreted through the lens of a house. At the same time, shared experiences across houses created overlapping memories. Lessons, events, and moments that involved multiple students often remained part of a broader collective memory, even if they were understood in different ways. This created a balance between individual perspective and shared history. As students moved beyond Hogwarts, these memories continued to evolve. They were revisited, reconsidered, and sometimes understood differently with time. The influence of the house system remained present, but it became part of a larger context, shaped by new experiences and changing perspectives. This process revealed something subtle about the system. It did not only shape the present, it influenced how the past was remembered. It provided a framework through which experiences were interpreted, both during and after they occurred. Over time, this contributed to the way Hogwarts itself was understood, not as a single, fixed experience, but as something that varied depending on perspective. Each student carried their own version of it, shaped by their house, their experiences, and the way those experiences were remembered. Despite these differences, a common thread remained, a sense that the time spent at Hogwarts had meaning, even if that meaning was interpreted in different ways. The house system did not create that meaning on its own, but it influenced how it was formed and how it was understood. In this way, the houses extended their influence into memory itself, not by controlling it, but by shaping the perspective through which it was viewed. And through that perspective, each student carried a version of Hogwarts with them, one that continued to exist long after they had left. As the pattern continued across generations, another aspect of the system became clearer in a gradual way. The houses did not only shape how students experienced Hogwarts, they also influenced how the school itself adapted over time, not through changes to its structure, but through the way each new group of students interacted with what already existed. Hogwarts, in its physical form, remained largely unchanged. The castle, the classrooms, and the traditions continued from one year to the next. But the experience within those spaces was never identical. Each generation brought its own perspective, shaped by the same house system, but expressed in slightly different ways. Within Gryffindor, the emphasis on action might appear differently depending on the students present. In one year, it might be visible in bold decisions, in another, in quieter forms of standing forward. The underlying value remained, but the way it was expressed could shift, influenced by the individuals who carried it. Ravenclaw followed a similar pattern. The pursuit of understanding remained constant, but the direction of that pursuit could change. One group might focus on certain areas of knowledge, while another might explore different questions. The environment supported learning, but it did not limit what could be learned. Hufflepuff's consistency allowed for gradual change to appear in subtle ways. Small adjustments in behavior, new approaches to shared routines, or shifts in how support was offered could alter the experience without disrupting its stability. Change, in this context, was not sudden, but cumulative. Slytherin's adaptability made change more intentional. Students might refine existing patterns, adjust their approach to challenges, or introduce new ways of navigating the environment. These changes were often guided by awareness, shaped by a focus on direction and outcome. Across all houses, this process created a system that was both stable and flexible. The core structure remained the same, but the way it was lived could evolve. This allowed Hogwarts to continue without needing constant redesign, adapting through the people within it rather than through changes imposed from outside. At the same time, the interaction between houses contributed to this evolution. Differences in perspective created variation, and that variation introduced new possibilities. A student observing a different approach might adopt part of it, bringing it into their own environment. Over time, these small exchanges influenced the overall experience of the school. This process was not always noticeable in the moment. It did not appear as a clear shift, but as a gradual adjustment. Only when viewed over longer periods did the changes become more visible, revealing how each generation had left its own mark. The house system played a central role in this. It provided continuity, ensuring that certain values remained present, but it also allowed for variation in how those values were expressed. This balance made it possible for Hogwarts to remain recognizable while still adapting to new contexts. What emerged was a form of evolution that did not rely on direct change to the system itself. Instead, it occurred through participation. Each student contributed, whether intentionally or not, to the ongoing development of the environment. Their actions, decisions, and interactions became part of the pattern that shaped what came next. Over time, this created a layered structure. The original ideas of the founders remained at the core, but they were surrounded by the accumulated influence of generations of students. Each layer added detail, making the system more complex without altering its foundation. In this way, Hogwarts continued to exist as both a constant and a changing place. The houses maintained their identity, but the way they were experienced was always in motion. And through this balance, the system remained active, shaped not only by what it was designed to be, but by how it was lived. As the system continued to function across time, one final pattern began to emerge in a more noticeable way. The houses did not only shape how students understood themselves or others, they influenced how students understood belonging. Not just in the sense of being placed somewhere, but in the deeper sense of feeling connected to something beyond themselves. Belonging at Hogwarts began with the moment of sorting, but it did not end there. It developed through shared experience, through repeated interaction, and through the gradual recognition of familiarity. A student did not simply belong to a house because they were placed there. They came to belong through participation, through the ways they engaged with the environment around them. In Gryffindor, belonging often formed through shared moments of action, facing challenges together, responding collectively to situations, and supporting one another in uncertain moments, created a strong sense of connection. These experiences, repeated over time, reinforced the feeling of being part of something that extended beyond the individual. Ravenclaw approached belonging through understanding. Shared ideas, conversations, and the pursuit of knowledge created connections that were based on perspective rather than circumstance alone. Students found belonging not just in being present, but in contributing to a shared process of learning and discovery. Hufflepuff built belonging through consistency. It was found in reliability, in the steady presence of others, and in the quiet assurance that support would be there when needed. This created a form of belonging that was stable, not dependent on a single moment, but on a pattern of experience that continued over time. Slytherin, in contrast, often approached belonging with awareness. It was shaped by shared direction, by the recognition of common goals, and by the understanding of how individuals related to one another within that context. This form of belonging was deliberate, built through recognition rather than assumption. These different forms of belonging did not exist in isolation. Students could experience them in multiple ways, even if one was more familiar than the others. The house system provided a primary environment, but it did not prevent connection beyond it. Belonging could extend across houses, formed through shared experience, mutual understanding, or common purpose. At the same time, the presence of houses made belonging more visible. It gave it structure, a place where it could develop and be recognized. Without that structure, belonging might still exist, but it would be less defined. The houses made it easier to identify, to experience, and to understand. Over time, this sense of belonging became one of the most lasting aspects of the system. It remained even as other elements changed, even as students moved beyond the school and into the wider world. The connection to a house did not disappear, even when its daily presence was no longer part of life. This continuity revealed something important about the system. It was not only about organization or development, it was about connection, about creating environments where individuals could find a place, not just in terms of structure, but in terms of experience. And yet, belonging was never entirely defined by the house itself. It was shaped by the individual, by how they engaged with their environment, and by how they formed connections within it. The house provided the framework, but the experience of belonging was created within that framework, through participation and interaction. In this way, the house system continued to influence not just how students developed, but how they felt connected to the world around them. It offered a starting point, a place where belonging could begin, even if it would later extend far beyond it. And through that process, the system fulfilled one of its quieter purposes, not just to sort or to guide, but to connect. As the system continued to influence identity, behavior, and belonging, another pattern became more visible over time. The houses did not only shape how students experienced Hogwarts, they also influenced how students understood difference itself. Not just the differences between houses, but the idea of difference as something that could be approached in more than one way. At first, difference often appeared as separation. Students recognized that each house had its own values, its own expectations, and its own way of approaching situations. These distinctions made it easier to understand the structure of the school, but they also created boundaries. A student might see another house as something distinct, defined by traits that felt separate from their own. Over time, however, this understanding began to change. Continued interaction revealed that difference did not always mean opposition. The qualities associated with each house were not in conflict by default. They could exist alongside one another, sometimes complementing each other, sometimes offering alternative perspectives. In Gryffindor, difference might be seen as something to engage with directly. A student might approach it through action, responding to unfamiliar situations with a willingness to participate rather than withdraw. This created an environment where difference was experienced rather than avoided. Ravenclaw approached difference through understanding. Instead of reacting immediately, a student might seek to learn more, to examine what made something unfamiliar, and to understand it in greater detail. This approach reduced uncertainty by replacing it with knowledge. Hufflepuff responded to difference with acceptance. A student might not feel the need to fully analyze or engage with every unfamiliar element, but they would allow it to exist without resistance. This created a sense of stability, where difference did not disrupt the overall environment. Slytherin, in contrast, often approached difference with awareness. A student might consider how unfamiliar elements fit within a larger context, evaluating their relevance and potential impact. This approach did not necessarily resist difference, but it placed it within a broader perspective. These different responses created a range of ways to engage with the unfamiliar. No single approach was presented as complete, and each offered its own advantages depending on the situation. Together, they formed a system where difference could be encountered in multiple ways. As students moved through this system, their understanding of difference became more complex. It was no longer something that simply divided houses. It became something that could be explored, understood, accepted, or integrated. This shift did not remove the distinctions between houses, but it changed how those distinctions were perceived. At the same time, the presence of difference remained essential to the system. Without it, the houses would lose their meaning. It was the variation between them that created the structure, that allowed multiple perspectives to exist within the same environment. What changed was not the existence of difference, but the way it was understood. It became less about separation and more about variation, less about fixed boundaries and more about different ways of approaching the same world. This understanding extended beyond Hogwarts. Students carried it with them, applying it to situations where difference appeared in new forms. The ability to recognize multiple perspectives, to see value in approaches that were not their own, became part of how they navigated the broader world. The house system, in this sense, did not eliminate difference. It made it visible, structured, and accessible. It provided a framework through which difference could be experienced and understood, rather than simply observed from a distance. And through this process, students learned something that remained with them long after they left. That difference was not something to be resolved or removed, but something to be understood. And that understanding did not come from a single perspective, but from the interaction of many. As the system continued to shape understanding in subtle ways, one more pattern became clear when viewed over a longer span of time. The houses did not only influence how students saw themselves or how they understood others. They influenced how students came to understand change, not as something sudden or disruptive, but as something that could unfold gradually within a stable structure. At Hogwarts, change rarely appeared in obvious ways. The castle remained, the traditions continued, and the house system itself stayed consistent. From the outside, it could seem as though very little shifted from one year to the next. But within that consistency, change was always present, moving slowly through the experiences of those within it. In Gryffindor, change might be noticed through moments of decision. A student who once hesitated might begin to act more readily. A response that once felt uncertain might become more immediate. These changes did not alter the structure of the house, but they changed how the values of the house were expressed. Ravenclaw experienced change through understanding. What was once unfamiliar could become clear over time, and ideas that seemed distant could gradually take shape. This process was not abrupt, but continuous, built through small moments of learning that accumulated into a broader perspective. Hufflepuff reflected change through consistency itself. Small adjustments, repeated over time, created shifts that were not immediately visible, but became significant when viewed together. The steady nature of the house allowed change to occur without disruption, blending into the routine rather than standing apart from it. Slytherin approached change with intention. A student might recognize the need to adapt and choose to adjust their approach accordingly. This form of change was often deliberate, guided by awareness rather than circumstance alone. Across all houses, these patterns revealed that change did not require the system itself to be altered. It could occur within the system, shaped by how individuals interacted with it. The structure provided stability, but within that stability, variation was always possible. At the same time, the interaction between students contributed to this process. Observing others, adapting to new situations, and responding to different perspectives all introduced subtle shifts. These shifts, repeated across many individuals, created a broader sense of movement within the school. What made this process distinct was its pace. Change at Hogwarts was rarely immediate. It unfolded over time, often unnoticed in the moment. Only when viewed from a distance did it become clear how much had shifted. The house system played a central role in maintaining this balance. It ensured that certain values remained constant, even as the way those values were expressed continued to evolve. This created an environment where stability and change could exist together, without one replacing the other. For students, this meant that growth did not require leaving the system behind. It could happen within it, through gradual adjustment and continued experience. The structure did not limit change. It provided a space where change could occur in a controlled and consistent way. Over time, this understanding extended beyond the school. Students learned to recognize that change did not always appear as a clear break from the past. It could emerge slowly, through small shifts that accumulated into something larger, and through this process, the house system revealed another of its quieter functions. Not just to define or to guide, but to allow change to exist without disrupting continuity. As everything within the system continued to unfold across time, a final understanding began to settle in a quieter, more complete way. The houses were never only about separation, identity, or structure on their own. They existed as part of a larger balance, one that allowed different ways of thinking, acting, and understanding to exist together without needing to be reduced into a single path. At Hogwarts, no single house was designed to represent everything. Each one carried a specific set of values, a particular way of approaching the world. Gryffindor emphasized action and response. Ravenclaw focused on thought and understanding. Hufflepuff grounded itself in consistency and support. Slytherin centered on direction and intention. Individually, each was incomplete. Together, they formed something more whole. This balance did not mean that the houses were equal in every moment. There were times when one approach became more visible, when certain qualities stood out more clearly than others. But over time, the presence of all four ensured that no single perspective remained dominant for long. Students moved through this balanced system without always recognizing it. They experienced one house directly, but they were always surrounded by the others. Even without leaving their own environment, they were aware of different approaches, different responses, and different ways of understanding the same situation. This constant presence of variation created a broader awareness. A student might begin by identifying strongly with their own house, seeing it as the clearest reflection of who they were. But over time, they might notice elements of themselves reflected elsewhere. Not as a contradiction, but as an expansion. The system allowed for this without requiring it. It did not force students to adopt every perspective, but it made those perspectives visible. It created an environment where multiple ways of being could exist side by side, each contributing something distinct to the whole. At the same time, the structure ensured continuity. The houses remained defined, their values consistent enough to be recognized across generations. This consistency provided stability, a sense that the system itself would endure even as individuals within it changed. What emerged from this balance was not a single outcome, but a range of possibilities. Students could follow the path most familiar to them, or they could gradually incorporate aspects of other approaches. The system did not limit them to one direction. It provided a starting point while leaving the outcome open. Over time, this created a pattern that extended beyond Hogwarts. The idea that different perspectives could exist together without needing to be unified into one became part of how students understood the world. They carried with them an awareness that complexity did not require simplification and that variation did not need to be resolved. The house system, in this sense, functioned as more than a method of organization. It became a way of presenting the world itself, not as a single path, but as a collection of paths that could exist alongside one another. And as each generation passed through the same structure, the pattern continued. The houses remained, the balance endured, and the system carried forward, shaped by those within it, but never fully defined by any single one of them. Over time, what began as a simple method of sorting became something far more lasting. The houses did not just divide students for the sake of order. They offered different ways of understanding the same world, each one incomplete on its own, but meaningful when seen together. What seemed like separation was often a form of structure, a way to make complexity easier to experience. Long after students left the castle, the influence of that structure remained, not in the form of rules or expectations, but in the quiet ways they approached decisions, relationships, and change. The lessons were not always obvious, and they were rarely taught directly. They emerged through experience, shaped by time and repetition. In the end, the system did not define who someone would become. It offered a place to begin, a framework that could guide without limiting. And as each generation moved forward, the pattern continued, steady and familiar, yet always slightly different, because the question was never just where someone belonged. It was how they chose to grow within it.